What's up, everyone? My name is Wes, and you're listening to the Ear Coffee Podcast. For today's episode, I was joined by Twin Cities-based multi-instrumentalist and composer Nick Bhalla. On top of playing in bands like Maria and the Coins, Dusty Forever, and Fragile Canyons, Nick has been releasing instrumental jazz pieces since 2021, including Invisible Ink, which is out now. Invisible Ink was previously titled Solo Piano, which is how we refer to it during the interview. Nick and I get into the weeds about improvisation and theory, talk about the joys of seeing live music, his approach to composing, and a whole lot more. Without any further ado, here's my interview with Nick Bhalla on the Ear Coffee Podcast. Today I'm joined by Nick and Baker Bhalla. Is that how you pronounce your last name? And at least
yeah.
Okay.
You can use either.
Either. Cool. Yeah. So just for people at home, since and also just because you've been in so many different projects over the years, why don't you just do a little brief introduction? Like Nate, what's your name? What's your like primary instruments? Like I know these answers, but just before we get into
it. Yeah, well, I'm Nick. I go by Nick Baker around town, but I use Nick Bhalla for my solo music name just because there's actually so many Nick Bakers out there already. And Bhalla comes from my mom's side. Like we're Indian, so I'm like half and half, and I actually spend a lot more time with my mom's side. So in some ways it feels kind of like my name is almost a chance to honor that. And there's something about like, well, your name doesn't just have to come from like the male side of your family. And it's been kind of interesting to play with having like the two last names from the two cultures that I'm from. So anyways, most people would probably see me around town playing guitar with Maria and the Coins and Dusty Forever and Neapolitan. And for a long time I was in Fragile Canyons, which like unfortunately kind of came to a close during the pandemic just because of people moving around. And
I think Norway or Andy moved to like somewhere in Scandinavia.
Andy moved to Geneva, Switzerland.
Switzerland. Okay. And I had the accent. Yeah. I was like, it's not Sweden, but it's somewhere. Okay. Switzerland.
We had a blast and we kind of went out on a high note, like playing at Big Turn Music Festival right before the pandemic started. And we were able to finish up a record like over the summer and at Casino Time Records. But yeah, so most people see me around town playing guitar with those bands. And in private, I spend a lot of time developing jazz piano. And it's been really fulfilling for me while I'm out gigging with all kinds of people. But like in my mornings and my time, I can kind of dissolve into this thing that's like a solo thing. And the piano is such a beautiful instrument to be able to do that. So
cool. That's a great introduction. Thank you. I like starting interviews off on the same foot for everybody because I've found over the years that basically anyone who is making art, making music, and goes the extra mile to release and record it and do all the things that come along with it, you probably have a pretty close and special relationship with music. And often that starts as a listener. So what was your relationship with music like when you were when you were growing up and you were first forming those connections? And was there like a time where it really solidified and kind of clicked, where you felt like it was something more personal versus just something that was like in the world or that you liked, but maybe it wasn't as important to you? And yeah, just talk a little bit about those formative experiences maybe.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's kind of funny because like this project is all about jazz, but for someone my age living in this culture, of course, I've been like, absorbing so much rock and indie music too. And I like thinking when you see someone do a project, you're not even aware of how many other things are in that melting pot. And
yeah.
So going back to your question, I think like I have this really formative memory of when the first Fleet Foxes album came out. And I don't think I'd ever realized that notes and chords could become this like planet you could live in. And that record has so much atmosphere that it could be from like the 1600s. Like they kind of brought you into this whole like atmospheric situation where it goes so far beyond like playing the instruments. And that was the first time I felt that. And it was like I was at the age where I was starting to pick out my own records. And and then with the jazz thing, I think around the same time I was getting into like, some of those a lot of people's like first favorite jazz records, like stuff like Kind of Blue and Waltz for Debbie, Mingus Aum, and like Take Five and or Time Out. I mean, and
yeah,
like some of the
I make the same mistake all the time.
yeah, right. I mean, just say the name of the single, right?
Yeah, Blue Rondo's better though. That's my hot take. That's my
Oh,
Brubeck
dude,
hot take.
sure.
I don't think it's really a hot take.
Yeah, we'll try to write a song in 2-2-2-3.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's like when I look back, it's almost hard to draw lines between how much I fell in love with like indie music and jazz while I was growing up. My background was like in high school playing in the jazz bands and the wind bands as a trumpet player.
Okay.
And then on weekends, like my friends and I would get together and write songs and learn, you know, like your Bon Iver covers on the guitars. And I was always playing piano since I was a little kid, and the trumpet and the guitar felt like I took things from the piano and put them onto the trumpet and guitar. Mm-hmm. And I think as a multi-instrumentalist, I always can use the piano as like a backbone for that. And that's kind of like my upbringing, you know?
Yeah. Like it definitely like informs like your kind of ideas of like the structure of music and like the things you learn just like growing up playing piano like intrinsically and in ways that you can't like put a finger on, like you were kind of saying, or just they aren't apparent, but they're there, which is super cool.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, let's jump into talking about at least the focus here is going to be the jazz composition, the music you've been releasing under your own name over the past few years. Going back to the first couple songs and releases that you had recorded, you mentioned, or I think there was something where you mentioned that the privacy and the solitude of the early pandemic is kind of helped catalyze or gave you time to catalyze and restore your relationship with jazz, maybe both as a listener and as obviously as a composer, because you composed a bunch of music throughout that process. But when were the ideas, like the seeds of these ideas, first starting to kind of grow, and when were they first planted before they even started going to the extra mile where you thought, oh, let's record this and release this? Like, what were those early kind of explorations like when what would become these songs and then your solo jazz releases, when they started to kind of start solidifying, I guess, as an idea?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. The winter before the pandemic, I was doing this exercise at the piano where like I would just pick one leading tone and then reharmonize it with like every possible chord.
Okay.
So to get like musically specific, if it was like C, you could descend from that and it'd be like the root of C and then like the flat 9 of B7 and then like the natural 9 of B flat, or, you know, for example, and play with picking one tone out with the right hand and finding every possible chord voicing that would make it a different extension in the left hand.
Oh, yeah.
And then from there, I had like a Monk book, a Train book, a Miles book, and then like the classic Hal Leonard fake books. And every day I would try to read down multiple tunes and improvise on them. And then I would transpose them and reharmonize them. And I was kind of like melting a lot of different language of standards in my head. And then when I would start reharmonizing stuff, I would try to come back to that leading tone play that I just mentioned and try to use that as like a springboard for recomposing things in a way that stops resembling the language of standards.
Yeah.
So a lot
kind
of
breaking out of that mold.
Yeah, totally. Like I think the project that's coming out right now is like significantly less diatonically based than a lot of standard music, but it's also not as weird as plenty of other stuff that's getting out right now in the world. Yeah,
it's like, and at least after listening to it, and we'll talk more about the solo piano stuff. It's like the chords are very like it's very intentional, and at least as a listener, it feels very intentional. You can follow the pathway of it, but it isn't like trying to get like super like, at least in a way that is more in your face, I guess, getting out there. The experimentation is more subtle, with kind of your approach to chord voicings and composition. Going back actually a little bit, how did you go from, I guess, just like playing trumpet and playing jazz and like in high school and taking those, like, assuming that's where it started, but taking those additional steps to really dive into like chord structure and composition and On maybe that was all part of kind of your upbringing on piano as well. Yeah, just kind of going back, talk a little bit about that because there's a lot of theory's hard, but it's very important. It's very cool. So like you have to learn a lot.
Yeah, like your question's like, how did I end up getting kind of down that path?
Yeah, like was that something that was already part of what you were like playing on piano when you were growing up and like before, or like was it more born out of your experience playing in jazz ensembles in school, like whether on trumpet or on piano? Like how did you take that kind of additional leap beyond just like, oh, I'm playing charts and I'm like playing like the standards, and to kind of taking that next step and like let not only just sitting down with a standard, like let's mess around with this, let's reharmonize this, let's kind of take a more a compositional approach to it and kind of deconstruct it.
Totally. I mean, I think you know that it's a cliche that you need to learn all the rules before you can break them.
Yeah.
Um, like some of my most formative memories of like really getting turned on to what you can do with jazz was like I was on a trumpet scholarship at St. Olaf,
Okay.
and so part of that I was like allowed to be like without being in all of the music program, I could be in like the top jazz program and study privately with jazz instructors
Mhm.
without having it be like my 24/7 thing. And by the time I was a junior and senior, my professor and I, my trumpet professor, we'd actually spend most of our time sitting over the piano and we'd look at like every extent, like, you know, if it's G major seven, like look at how you can get it, including sevens, nines, 11s, 13s, and how you can take an entire mode and like reshape it around
Mhm.
every chord. And when you're improvising fluidly, you have to be able to think that way. And that's even just to play over basic stuff.
Yeah.
And most people in my trumpet studio were like reading sheet music to play something perfectly the way that it was written. And I'd go to my studio class and I had my guitar looper pedal and I'd play the that I made the night before and I would just like improvise with my horn on my guitar backing track. And everyone else in the studio was like, I don't know what this guy's doing. I'm trying to play Haydn and Hummel.
Oh
Um,
boy.
and I mean, I love classical
Yeah,
music
yeah.
too.
Not to knock it, but like it's just like I also went to like took like music classes. Like I'm very familiar with like that kind of like they're very structured. Like they're there to read the sheet music and play these phenomenal like historically wonderful pieces, but then they're just seeing like something completely out of that wheelhouse.
Right. And it was kind of funny to see people react. And I don't know, I actually remember in high school, like getting a jazz award and like the other trumpet player that I was competing with was like, all he's doing is like just playing whatever he wants. It's like, I mean, it's kind of, you know, improvised music kind of gets frowned upon by people who aren't interested in it. And they
Yeah.
think it's just this random meandering that doesn't take any direction. And I'll be here in this interview to stick up for it. You know?
Yeah, no, we have to fight for our right to improvise and
Yeah. I mean,
defend
come on.
it.
I
uh,
appreciate that. But yeah.
yeah.
And then like, so that was kind of my bread and butter was like those time in college. And it was more like, when I was like 25, I became like a full-time music professional and I was really playing guitar like all day, every day and reharmonizing with a guitar and including leading tones, like that sort of Joe Pass thing was like really attractive to me because I felt like I could contain so many different skills. Like if I sat down and worked on that for a couple hours a day, it's like you're looking at voicings, leading tones, improvising, you're finger picking, and you're doing like left hand, all kinds of weird chord shapes. And it made me feel like I was just kind of adding more rungs to like the guitar ladder. And
Yeah.
it turned out when I went back to the piano, all that theory stuff just kind of fell right back in because I mean, I learned the piano 10 years before I ever learned to grab a guitar. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Like the nice thing is you really only need to like learn like that kind of theory like once, and then it's just all about applying it different ways and like expanding your understanding, I guess. Um, Yeah. So let's talk about Limitations in an Emergency. That was the first EP you released with this style with your under your given name or under your, I don't know how you want to refer to it, under your name. We'll say that.
Yeah.
And it's obviously different from solo piano because you are actually there's a lot of guitar playing on it. I'm assuming you also played the bass parts on it. And was it like entirely self-recorded, or did you have like were you able to get some friends to like once it was safe to do so, or remotely, or was it all done in house?
That so every note on that was like me
Hmm.
in my place. I mean, we're talking about August 2020. So like you could hang out with your friends outside, but like
Yeah.
nobody was doing nothing. And my living room like was a disaster. Like I opened the hood of the piano, I had mics in the hood around the hammers, and then I'd finish tracking that, and then I'd move all my mics and put them on my amp face in the biggest room in my house. And I would kind of combine the guitar and piano, and then I'd run bass and supplied that as well. And it was honestly really awesome to have something that took up my whole brain space, because I think everybody looks back on that time as being kind of like unfulfilling, depressing,
Very
underwhelming.
untethered. Yeah.
Like everyone was just kind of waiting for vaccines and there wasn't anything to do. And I feel like for anybody who has musical self-direction, it was
Hmm.
really almost kind of a like, I don't want to minimize how difficult that time was for everybody, but in some
Yeah.
ways the amount of time we had felt like a blessing once I looked at it that way.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, I did. So the guitar, piano, and bass was all just kind of done at my place, and
Yeah.
was lucky to have Colin Lonican at the Swamp do all the mastering and mixing.
Okay.
So that was really
Nice. Yeah.
fantastic.
What led you to explore that space in jazz in composition? Like with, I mean, with the limited instrumentation that you had and the limited everything that everybody had, like you were saying, with it being August 2020. Um, pardon me. And I think you mentioned like some other influences and just like especially like a lot of the great guitarists. Since it does feel like a duet between the guitar and the piano on the tracks where the pieces where both are featured. So yeah, talk a little bit about how you kind of went down that rabbit hole and ended up almost like duetting with yourself. That's kind of what it felt like listening to, just very fluidly as just, I'm not thinking about the recording process. It's like I'm sitting back and enjoying the pieces, but then it's a whole nother thing. It's like, yeah, that's all you're just duetting opposite yourself or with yourself, which is
Yeah.
cool.
No, that's a great question. I think it's hard for me not to emphasize how it was very situational, because like I think jazz is fundamentally a conversational social art form, that like the most beautiful moments in jazz are like when people are together bouncing things off each other in the moment.
Hmm.
And so as much as I believe that, there's like this irony that I simulated it by doing it myself with dubbing.
Yeah.
But like that being said, I never would have thought of that unless someone was like, "Hey, you gotta be locked in your house for like a year and a half." Like, so the
Yeah.
situation brought me there. But I think there's this psychological thing where like, yeah, let's say the piano's laid down the chords and I have that loop open and I'm going to play some guitar solos over it, then I need to just imagine that it's someone else. And like when I'm listening and comping or taking a solo, you just imagine that it's someone else and it's
Hmm.
not anyone specific. You're just listening as carefully as you can. And I
Yeah.
don't know, it ended up being this kind of like, I'll figure it out while it's happening. And I think that's kind of the beauty of jazz. And I tried to keep it as improvised as I
Yeah.
could.
That reminds me, I was listening to I'm outing myself as a podcaster by saying that I listen to Mark Maron, but he was interviewing Austin Butler, star of Elvis, and he was talking about like his experience like recording like auditions where he would play both. He'd have to do like both characters in the scene and kind of would have to do that. Whereas like just record all of it like one character at a time, but having to imagine like having someone to play off of, because if it's like a two-person scene or it's a multiple person ensemble, like you're saying, that's most of the time what makes it jazz, what makes it beautiful, what makes kind of fulfills it in a lot of ways. And dealing with those limitations is a challenge, but it's a challenge that was overcome. So it's cool to see the ways that people manage to do that and explore their kind of their creativity and their approach within those limitations.
Yeah. Well, now you can see where I got the album title from.
Absolutely, yeah. It is much more literal than I really just kind of applied my brain to this. Like, yeah, limitations in it. Yeah, that is very literal as well as being you can interpret however you want. Or it's not like it's called COVID album or something. It's like as
Yeah.
aggressively of its time like that. Cool. Let's talk about Solo Piano, which is your forthcoming record. There have been, I think, as of recording, 4 singles, at least a sequence of singles that have been released, and it does live up to the title. What made you want to really just focus on piano? Because you'd been obviously reintroduced to it and like really been spending a lot of time with it, with limitations, but obviously you play a lot of guitar, you play trumpet, you play all these other instruments. What was like, no, I want to do just piano. I want to compose just these pieces for just my 2 hands.
Yeah. The funny thing is, like, I feel like I can be really introverted and do my own thing for like a super big chunk of the day. And then like I really love kind of being with people all day and like playing music in all these different bands, and like I'll stay out at a gig until they close down, and like I love being around people. But when I have that time to myself, I kind of want it to be like really concentrated on something. And I think with the guitar, it's kind of a funny instrument because like there's really very few people who can sort of play unaccompanied with melody and harmony, like the Joe Pass thing. And the instrument is kind of best fit with like people to play with, and
Absolutely.
I feel really fortunate to have the role as the guitar player in like 3 or 4, however many bands nowadays. And like, I've kind of started shaping myself around like spending my playing time around the piano because it's so self-contained that I can like accompany myself, compose, improvise, read down charts, like learn other people's music. And then my guitar kind of like lives in my doorway when it's ready to go out to band practice and gigs. I feel like it's taken me a long time to find this rhythm as a multi-instrumentalist. And I'm also a teacher. Like I teach lessons on all the instruments we just mentioned. And so I just think the piano can kind of capture so much about harmony and melody in a way that even if I don't grab a guitar until I go to a gig that day, like my ears have been really busy at the piano.
Yeah. There's consistency, and like it carries over for just like the days listening, the days exploring. I've never really thought about it like that. Were the pieces mostly born of like just kind of improvising over some chord structures or like some patterns that you were playing with? Was it a mixture of that with obviously like some very intentional, like, I have this melody that I like and these chords that I want to incorporate, and let's see how I can incorporate those? Like, what was the actual process for creating these pieces themselves and the pieces that we have yet to hear?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question too, because it's kind of healthy for me to try to explain it. But essentially, like what I first mentioned like earlier in our interview about like playing with leading tones and just sitting until they were fully reharmonized in every possible way. When I kind of went back into composition for solo piano, I was doing that, but less as an exercise and more like specifically looking for composition. So the takes that you hear that I'm releasing, what I would see is like I'd sit at the piano and have a lead sheet of my own harmony that was composed by carefully playing with all kinds of leading tones, but there's no composed melody. So I sit there and I just hit record. I look at my like set of chords and just freely improvise. And then I kind of did a bunch of takes, and then I slept on them for a while. And then I went back and picked out the ones that I felt like had, that sense of when someone's improvising, it should totally have direction and melody and structure. And it doesn't mean that it's just like this meandering nonsense. Like I wanted it to have this like sense of phrasing and direction, and something that like, if you listen to them a few times, you can find little passages that where it's going to happen. And it's not just someone like, jamming or whatever. You know what I mean?
It's not like just empty calories. There's meat on these bones. It kind of going back to what you said about kind of the idea of the piano as a solo instrument. And I'm assuming you know this record since you are very knowledgeable about your jazz, but it made me think of like the Colne concert, the Keith Jarrett piece, where like I don't really have an idea of like someone else doing that with guitar or something like that. It's like makes a lot of sense as a piano piece. Like I'm sure there are plenty of wonderful compositions or like recordings out there where it is just solo guitar in like that kind of context, but that is at least where my mind went. And now kind of talking about that, and I don't know. Now I just really want to listen to Cole concert, but that's neither here nor there.
I have a copy of it in my car somewhere.
On CD. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, somewhere in my Toyota, I got that buried
somewhere. And that's a must-have in the car. Just you never know when you're going to need it.
Totally. Which my drive to work was longer, so I could
actually get through the whole thing. Moving kind of beyond that a little bit. I guess before we do that, what is the kind of timeline looking like for the full album, for any future pieces? Because we have the 4 that are available. Sounds like there's going to be more. I hope there's going to be more. Where are you kind of at with that before we move on?
So there's really only one more, and it's already slated for March 24. Okay. And then the full thing just comes re-released as a package on the 31st. So just doing the Friday thing. And nowadays everybody kind of wants to hear single by single. And I think it's a little funny to me because I'm like most musicians, kind of a full album listener only. And the way that I selected all these tracks was to like have them belong to, I mean, we're talking about like, I don't know how many takes I sifted through to pick out these 5 and put them in an order. And then you look at releasing stuff and it's like everybody just kind of wants to do one song at a time. But pretty soon the whole thing. Soon. I mean, you have almost the whole thing, you know?
Yeah. We're waiting for the last one. The way everything's released, at least on Spotify now with singles, is like they just get added to like an EP or something. So it's like, the new single is track 1 and then the previous single is track 2. And you're just kind of building it in reverse. It's so weird because like keep the singles as singles and let me listen to the album when it's out. I just thought of this, but with all those takes that you did and all the different recordings, like for each piece, how much variation really was there, like between the different takes? Like if I sat down and did like a blind listening test of 2 different takes of the same piece, like I'm guessing there'd be at least a decent amount of overlap, but like what was that kind of like sifting through it and really arriving on those takes is like, this is the one that I think is accomplishing what I want. This is the most fulfilling. This is going to be the one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really a subjective question, right? Like how different are takes of an improvised piece of music? And I think that's a phenomenal question because it's going to make people think more carefully about like, what does improvised music mean? And like, how different was it? And like, if you go see a band on 2 different nights that improvises a lot, like, should it be a different show? Absolutely. It should be a different show. Yeah. And that's why you see people that can have those residencies, or you follow a band around, or they release like every show from the thing. And so what was most helpful for me wasn't really like listening back, obviously was huge. But what I really did was like, I had a journal sitting right next to my piano. And as soon as the take was done, I would write in there if I thought it was worth keeping. And I would kind of like, I wouldn't delete stuff. So I actually still have a giant hard drive somewhere with all the stuff I never use, which might be kind of fun to like, I don't know, maybe I'll share it sometime because it's just kind of more cuts of the cake. But
it's all the B-sides and demos for the 10th anniversary reissue or whatever.
Yeah. Your heads can get their box set behind the desk at Cheapo and shit. But, what I did though, there was an interesting thing about like my gut reaction to grab my pen in the journal the second it was over, I think was like, if I never did that, the sifting through would have been really hard because there's something about what did that musician feel like when that show happened or when that take happened? Like, I'd love to hear that from people who have done those alternate takes, all those, infinite numbers of B-sides that people have put out and be like, what did you think? Like, what was the energy in the room when you finished the cut? Was everybody like, oh man, that was sick?
Yeah. And like, you even think of like, not to harp on reissues, but like with a lot of like specifically jazz that gets reissued, like a lot of the new material is just going to be like alternate takes of like the 5 or 6, however many main compositions are on the albums. But like a lot of time that's just really the soloing is different, whereas like they have like a core like head that they're obviously centered around versus it's just an improvisation. So like that's an interesting kind of contrast to think about without even hearing all the hard drive of goodies.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're looking forward to March 31st. Hopefully, we'll get that out by then. And I'm glad I know at the very least when to look forward to it. Kind of moving on to talk more broadly about all the different bands and ensembles that you've played with and are playing with. What has drawn you to play in so many different, not only just styles of music, but with so many different groups of people? Because being in a band with people is a very deliberate and can be a very difficult thing, just because and you need to find a lot of balance to make that work. And so what has drawn you to all these different ensembles and bands over the years, whether especially playing just with someone else's quote unquote songs? It's you're playing in the band, you're not singing lead like you are with Pharma Bums, for example, where that was a little bit more front and center. If that question made sense.
No, I think that's an awesome question because for anyone who plays in the Twin Cities, it's such a small scene that a lot of people are in a bunch of projects. And when I was 21, 22 and Marie and the Coins had started chopping around town and stuff, and then people see you play and you get together and jam and you get invited to do more stuff. But coming back to your question, I think it's ever since I was a kid, my mom will still tell me man, we never had to tell you to practice. I love practicing.
That's rare. That rules.
Well, and especially now that I'm a teacher, I'm I wish I saw that a little bit more.
I believe it.
Ever since I was a kid, it was the time that I had. Sometimes I think about having quality time with yourself, and I always wanted that almost addictive quality of oh, I'm not done yet. And when it became a social thing, it's exponentially more fun. In high school, I always tell my high school students that as soon as someone in your friend group that plays music got their driver's license, all we did was go to the record stores and then go back to his house, put all the records on and jam. And now that I'm a grown up, it's you can take as many hours in your week as you want and find people that you really enjoy and make music with them. And once you catch on that train, it's really hard to get off because it's not even performing. My favorite processes are I love band practice. I love hanging around the studio, and even just group chats are fun. And sometimes performing feels one little slice of what being in a band, a great band is always a group of friends first.
Yeah.
And for people, who have that addictive quality to music, you automatically magnetize with people who have the same quality.
Yeah.
When I met people like Maria or Andy from Fragile Canyons, people who kind of live for absorbing as much as they can and creating music, it's very natural to have deep friendships. And when you're making music that you believe in and it's with people that you care about, you just keep chasing.
It's very symbiotic. You're gaining energy from them, and hopefully and doing what you can to reciprocate that and just kind of, I don't want to say feeding off of each other because that sounds everyone's an insect, but it's much more positive is at least how I'm conceptualizing and how you were describing it.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. What have been some various highlights over the years, whether that has been something as kind of mundane as a band group chat, if there was something that stood out, or whether it was a particularly stellar show that you played with Fragile Canyons, with Dusty, with Pharma Bombs, if you ever got around to playing any shows with those songs, or just what have been some of the memories and the moments that have stood out over the years?
Yeah. One that comes to mind really quickly is the first show that I played after everything got reopened was Marie and the Coins pretty much sold out the 7th Street entry.
Oh, hell yeah.
And yeah, it's such a great room. Everybody has memories of that room. I remember before I was even 21, we'd get in and try to see touring bands there. And every time we play there, it's great monitor mix and all that. But what I really remember was man, people are pushing up to the monitors to get up to the stage, and people are dancing, and nobody wants to leave. And everyone had been stuck in their house. And I felt this thing where for a lot of music professionals, you can get a little bit jaded about how much you're out gigging. And that night I was everybody in this room is just so grateful to have live music back again.
Yeah.
And every time anybody went to a show, you just feel that sense of man, you can take anything for granted. And when you remember that it comes back, it's so special.
Yeah. It's like a boom, like almost like a boomerang. It's like we threw it out, and it's like you can still see it, and you're like, yeah, this is, you can still see why, like maybe not why you play music, but like all those beautiful things that happen when you're at a show, and then it gets further and further away, and you're like, oh, I can't even see it anymore, and finally it comes back and hits you in the face. You're like, oh yeah, now I remember why this is so important, and why I love doing this so much.
Yeah, I mean, and having I really like being on both sides of it. Like I'll tell you the same feeling from like going to shows, and like
Yeah.
I'll be the person shoving up to the monitors, and like I'll be there dancing, and like going out to see live music, I think is anytime you feel that lull in your appreciation for, especially if it's something you do 24/7, like going to a show always sets me up right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. For me, that I don't know if you've had the opportunity to go on the road or like tour with any of the different bands, but like playing like small shows in places you've never been to before, and finding that joy, both as a performer and as like seeing, like, especially when it's like the only people in the room are like your band and the other people in the other bands, and you're just kind of playing for each other. But then sometimes that's like, you can find the most fulfillment in that. Like it's phenomenal when everybody comes out and like you have a sold out show that kicks so much ass. But you can find that that reminder of like, oh yeah, this is why we do this. This is so fulfilling. Yeah. Have you toured around, or like have you mostly just been like focusing on playing with, I mean, like 6-7 different bands? Like I'm sure it must be hard to schedule.
No, it's just, I think it's really funny that you just asked me that, because in the morning, Marie and the Coins is back in the band.
Oh, so. What? I must have like, Instagram has been hiding y'all's posts or whatever. Where are you going? Where are you going on tour?
Yeah, we're going to Des Moines, Chicago, Madison.
Okay. That's cool.
And it's like a test run for doing bigger and bigger stuff. And yeah, I think it's funny because like in Minneapolis, like every major city is pretty far hike away. And winter is so long that you meet a lot of indie musicians here that don't really tour.
Yeah.
Because there's only a few months of the year that you can do it without dying. And like even Madison's like 4 hours, Des Moines 4 hours, Omaha 6 hours.
Chicago is 6-7 with traffic.
Right. But I mean, I really like the day trips too. Like we went up to Superior, and like we did Big Turn Music Fest in Red Wing.
Yeah.
Like even those situations, like what you're saying earlier about like having a bunch of strangers soak it up feels really good, and kind of adds to that feeling like, hey, we're really just like, you can't ask anyone to give up anything more than like the time that they have, and like committing to living in a van for 4 days with a group of people.
Yeah. No, like, and both as a listener and as a performer, like you were kind of saying, like it's important to remind yourself and refresh yourself on both sides of the coin, because pun not intended, that was not a Marie and the Coins joke.
Happens a lot.
I believe it. Yeah, no, that's super exciting. I hope the tour goes really well.
Thanks, man. It's just hilarious that you asked me. I'm packing my bag like as soon as we're done with it.
That's so serendipitous. That's awesome. So I did want to talk a little bit more about how education has played a role, like your role as an educator, because we already talked about a little bit about your experience like at St. Olaf and everything. How is that, like the role of education and teaching on all these different instruments, how is that informed kind of your conception of your own music or of music listening? Because like you have your own viewpoint, and then you're kind of having to empathize with someone else's and like kind of get on the same level, get on the same perspective as much as you can, or what you're hoping to do. Has there kind of been like some playing back and forth, like a game of tennis between you as a performer and then you as an educator? Like how have all these things kind of enmeshed? Since you're aware of many hats.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like I some people like the term musician, but I really like the term music professional, because there's so many people that do like a million things. Like that person you see running the soundboard, you don't know that they're in another band and they work at a studio, and
they probably do. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, like all of us who do the music thing, especially in a small town, it's likely that you're out doing a whole lot of stuff. And I guess I wouldn't say that I find a ton of cross between those things, because I mean, well, it's kind of funny to think about. I guess it's an interesting question. Sometimes I like to draw from my experiences when I'm teaching, because like I see people of all ages, and it's easy to be like, oh, well, when I was like kind of at this stage, this is something I would have tried. Or like, oh, when you get together and play with people, that's the one I like to bring up a lot, because
Yeah.
lessons, you get a lot of people who just play by themselves and learn by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And you hit certain points where there's things you really only can learn by getting together with people. And that's
Absolutely.
something like I can draw from, like jazz students asking how to learn about comping. And I'm like, you don't got anybody to play with.
Yeah.
Like, why?
Like
You know what I'm saying? Or
you can
like,
set up like an app to do that, but like that's definitely not the same. Like you need to find other people. You need to get in a room.
and that's what I tell everybody, because I think it's so important. And like, I was just reflecting on this the other day. Like when I took my classical piano and trumpet lessons, I never thought to mention to my teacher that like on the weekend I was teaching myself to play guitar and learning like folk covers and playing coffee shops. But I'm like, why wouldn't I want to tell a music teacher that I was out playing? Like I was out gigging when I was like
Yeah.
16, 17. And like now I love hearing that from my students, and many of them play a second instrument, or like I'll ask them how their concert went in the school band where they go play their horn, because all of it melts in your head. And like fundamentally, I think of myself as a multi-instrumentalist, and I try not to stay too married to one instrument,
Yeah.
even if most people out there think I'm a guitar player. But I try, like teaching is so good to like let all that stuff muddle together sometimes. You know?
Yeah. It's like I don't even know if muddle is the right word, because like it's still everything's so clear, but it is like all mixed together. It's like it's both. I don't know. That's a lot, much to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like everything.
All right. Describe a moment, and this is maybe kind of similar to the highlight from playing around, but if you can think of a moment where, like a time when you felt like you were fulfilling, or kind of you're reaching a point where it's like, this is what I want. This is why I do music. This is what I want to get out of being a music professional, of being a musician, of whether that was like listening to like your first mixes of an album and like hearing the songs and like in that new light, or just like a particularly special like live performance, especially in the context of jazz, where it is just so of the moment. All music is, but like, especially with jazz. Yeah, just like a moment when you really just felt totally fulfilled as a musician. You're like, this is why I want to do this. This is what I want to get out of this. Like if I can get something close to this with everything I'm doing, then we found the solution. And nobody gets there, but it's something to keep striving for, I guess.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because it's like there's a part of me that feels like it's always known that this was what's going to go happen. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think a lot of people with that music addiction bone, kind of like, it's hard to remember a time when you didn't feel that way.
Yeah.
But it's difficult. I think like I have a tender spot for young people who there's like multiple things that they're really passionate about. And like when I talk to my high schoolers, and like they're so skilled with music, but they also just love a bunch of other things, and trying to think like it doesn't need to be this way. And I don't think I really knew until maybe I was like 25 that it was going to be like the whole thing. But I mean, yeah, to come back to what you actually asked me before I just keep rambling on, is
You're
like,
good.
I remember in college, my band was given the opportunity to open for Caroline Smith.
Oh, wow.
And that was really, really cool. And just realizing like this thing that's like, okay, at the core of every band, you should be getting together because you enjoy the people you're with, and it's awesome to just make music, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then realizing that could like other people actually think it's all right too.
Yeah.
And crossing over, like we think it's cool, like the four of us in the band think it's pretty good. And then realizing other people will actually turn out and see it and being like, you know what, like let's see where this thing goes. And that was my senior year, and as soon as I was old enough to get into bars, we pretty much just gigged as much as we could.
Yeah, fantastic. What's something that you truly love about your own like artistic approach, or like the music that you have made? Like whether that's like one thing, or just kind of an example of one thing that you do, because hopefully I want people to love the music that they make in a lot of different ways. But like, what is something that you really have grown to appreciate, and you can always kind of rely on about your own art and your own music?
I like to think that the people that I'm surrounded by can depend on me for flexibility. because I think a lot of times it can just feel really healthy to be able to say like, hey, all morning I played jazz piano, but like at night I'm supposed to bring my mandolin to a dinner club. And just like the people around me, I hope know that they can ask me to do many different things. And that's something that I can offer them. And the funny thing about working through the release of this album is that, like, you know, to the playlists and the world, it's just solo piano.
Yeah.
But if you know me, it's like one little sliver of like, I really like to get my hands on so many different kinds of music. And I like to think that my experiences with like indie and rock music sort of like inform the jazz and vice versa. Even if you don't hear it in the notes, like that's who I am as a person. And
yeah,
I like to think that I can, like, I love listening to such a huge variety of stuff like we all do. And I just like to try a little bit of everything. And then if someone wants to call me up to work on their songs, like, let me help you figure them out. And like, find, if you want me to play lead guitar, I love doing that. And my favorite part of that is like, I get to be on the inside of somebody's songs. Like I can hear every lyric and I can get really deep into what they're working on. And I hope that's something that I can be dependable for, you know?
Yeah, no, that resonates. Cool. Before we wrap up, just want to take a second. Solo Piano, it's gonna be out as a full album on streaming services, as that is the way that we consume music, on March 31st. So stay tuned for that. Hell yeah. I love asking everyone that I've talked to, what are some bands that you want to shout out and like you recommend, primarily like local bands. We've already kind of mentioned all your different projects. So I can't recommend, I've heard a handful of them. So I recommend scrubbing back in the episode to hear when Nick listed all the other bands. So check those out. But what are some like other musicians or bands that you have encountered in the scene, either as a listener or as like a fellow, you're playing the show with them? Like who do you want to turn people on to, or just shout out and spread the love a little bit before we end our time here?
Yeah, big time. Big shout out to Harlow.
Big shout out to Harlow. Yeah.
Serious Machine is unbelievable. Like if you go see them, it's just the most like plugged in, communicative trio of people I've ever seen. It's like they're one person playing three people. It's crazy.
Oh wow. Okay.
Gotta shout out Full Catholic too. It's like the most amazing combination of different like dark and light energy. It's like impossible to explain. You just gotta go see it.
Full Catholic. Yeah, the balance of dark and light. They lived up to the name.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Gotta shout out Grand Couriers too.
Okay.
A great band. There's just like, I don't know, the scene is so awesome. You can walk into so many clubs and just hear something amazing. And
no, literally, like you just like walk into like any like bar venue on like almost any night of the week, and there's probably at least one or two bands playing.
Absolutely.
Cool. Do you have any other things you want to plug before we wrap up our time here, besides just like we could follow you on Bandcamp, follow you on social media maybe, or just like what's the best way to stay tuned for other future endeavors and projects?
Yeah, man, you know, I'm not very techie because I kind of like just sitting with pencils and instruments, but
hey, that's so fair.
You can find me on all streaming services, like all the major ones. And then my Instagram is just nick.bhalla, which is BHALLA. And I'm not very great about using it, but like when I have music, I'm like, okay, I'm supposed to do this.
Yeah.
But I'm like inconsistent, but I'm around. Yeah.
As long as people are hearing about the music, that's the most important thing.
Sure, man.
Cool.
And I just want to thank you for your time. And this has been a really, really fun interview. And your coffee's the local scene.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been fun finally getting to chat with you after, like, I went back to when I was trying to remember the name. I'm like, I know Nick has written a bunch of songs. Like I wrote about the project. I found that I was like, oh yeah, there was Pharma Bums, and that was like 2019 or something. It was like right before or 2020. So I appreciate the long time support, and glad we could finally get you on the show to talk about a really cool album coming out. Have a great rest of your night, Nick. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
The Ear Coffee Podcast is a companion to the blog of the same name. If you like this episode, please leave us a rate and review so we can stand out among the other music podcasts. You can follow us at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram @Ear Coffee. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.